So this is strengthening the practice of cultural values. And I'll start up kind of slowly because I think people are kind of still filtering into the room. It's nice to see everybody though. And this is actually a topic that goes back some time for me personally and professionally. Um, and I'll tell you a little bit about that as we go. But it really goes back to an interest years ago, in starting in the early 80s, actually, in looking at organizational culture and how that has evolved, and how I think we've actually come up with a way to make culture happen in a more precise and explicit way, in organizations than it often does. So let me just go forward here. Although before we get into the topic, I want to do a couple things. One is we're not going to have a webinar in June, and that's because we have our annual Summer Institute in the middle of June, and we're going to be real busy. And by the time we finish the Summer Institute, I at least will be fried, I'm sure. But we are in July going to have our next one, and it's actually going to be a kind of a revision, but a version of something I did at the International Society for Performance Improvement conference a couple months ago. I guess it was last month, and it was very well received, and people found it very interesting. And it's really just about leveraging the simple models and language of our work to partner and communicate with people. So you'll get notices about that. Be sure to, anybody here is obviously signed up for our webinars, or hopefully is, but anyway, that'll be coming up in July, but we will not be having a session in June. And then this is our shameless commerce page. I don't know if any of you folks were ever into car talk. I loved Click and Clack, the Tappet brothers, as you can see up on the left there, and they were very funny fellows. And they always talked about their shameless commerce a moment. And this is ours. I want to mention that although the time is getting short, the Summer Institute is happening June 12th to 16th on Bainbridge Island. We're getting real excited about it. The program's, kind of crystallizing, and we're going to have quite a range of things. You can go to performancethinking.com and click on the thing on the right side of the homepage and get to all the information you need to know about it. I don't really expect people are necessarily going to go from not knowing about it to signing up in the next week or so, but we are still offering our discount. We've just let the deadline slip, and people can still get the discount for signing up. I think it's going to be a really good event. And then the other thing about the Summer Institute is, you can go through our programs and you can maybe attend some of these webinars and so forth. But when you get together with 30 to 50 people, which is how many people show up at our Summer Institute, you get quite a cross section of different types of people and applications and roles. So you get a much bigger picture of sort of what we've been doing for the last 20 years, really, and how our colleagues have been doing this work. And then the other thing I want to mention is we will not be having an open practitioner program this summer for lots of reasons. It's always hard to recruit people to that because they're on family vacations and such. But we will be starting an open virtual practitioner program in September 13th, and you can also find that out about that on our webpage. It's a great way for an individual inside of a company to sort of test it out as a performance consulting methodology, and then to possibly bring in others from your company. It's a great way for individuals to go through it and so forth. So I just wanted to highlight that. So there's a download here that I'm going to allow you to download, if I can do this properly. Files, there we go. So I'm going to share this thing, and I think if you look on your screen, you will probably see some indication that you can download this. This is a sort of an academic article that I published in 2016, I believe it was, on the topic that we'll be talking about today. And it's although we've evolved a little bit since then in how we think about it, as I often point out, culture is one of those things everybody talks about, but not that many people really do things with, it seems to me. And so it hasn't changed dramatically in our thinking since 2016. But anyway, this is the somewhat academic article that sort of unpacks the same points I'll be making today. And so I can leave that open so you can download it at your leisure. I also want to highlight something else. Through a series of actually wonderful coincidences. My colleague, um, John Skank introduced me really, or provided an opportunity to meet Johnny Taylor. And Johnny Taylor is the CEO of the Society of Human Resource Management. And as many of you know, and probably some of you share this, I've always had challenges in working with HR people, because HR people often are very transactional and very much about very important things. But of course, if one's interest is in performance, then that's not always the place to go. However, Johnny Taylor is quite a different person. He started out as a labor lawyer. He realized that many of the issues that came up were related to human resources. He got involved in human resource management. He subsequently wound up being a chief executive of a major business unit in one company, and at some point was the CEO of the Marshall Fund, a not-for-profit, and now is CEO of SHRM, or SHRM, as we like to call it. And he's a real business-oriented person, extremely smart, and very articulate. And so my friend John brought this book to my attention, Reset, that Johnny published, I think at the end of last year. And I really recommend it to you all. It's got a lot to do both with sort of resetting after COVID, like what do we do now? How do we take a look at things and move forward? But of course, it also has a great deal about diversity and inclusion, which is a big topic of his. And this phrase here, or this thing, transformation begins with a change in culture, is something he talks quite a bit about. And I would say that he really lays out strategies and tactics, or at least principles, about why certain things have not worked well and how they could work better. And so I find it an inspiring book, and we actually have had some very interesting discussions with him and the folks that work with him about sort of bringing performance thinking possibly more deeply into the world of SHRM. We, of course, have our HR Business Partner program. We offer at SHRM professional development credits for our practitioner program. But I think we now have a leader in human resources of 300,000 people in that organization who's going to help move HR into the 21st century. So I'm pretty excited about this. My point is that transformation begins with a change in culture. Fair enough. But what I have to say, and I even saw a quotation to this effect on social media the other day about culture begins at the top. Well, at some level it does. But as Johnny Taylor points out, you can't just put a chief diversity officer in place and expect that to work. You can't just have committees. There's got to be a way to drive the actual practice of values down into the organization. And I think it's something that he raises a lot of questions about. But I would argue, how do we do this? And that's really the context in which I want to talk here in this session. So, here's the agenda. I want to talk a little bit about the way I've perceived this issue for a long time, this general issue of how do we deal with culture? How do we actually change culture? And then I want to talk a little bit, almost everybody in this group, I think, knows something about performance thinking, but for the sake of those who don't, and just to highlight the things that I think are relevant, I want to talk a little bit about essentials of our models to then set us up for looking at kind of history since about 1980 of how various people have approached organizational culture, and then talk about what we think can really make a difference, and how we think that using a performance thinking perspective, you can set expectations and you can strengthen the practice of values. So that's kind of the overview of what we want to talk about today. So the question is, what is the challenge? What's the issue here? We all know culture is important. We talk about culture in a variety of ways, but I've seen it for many years as kind of like the Supreme Court justice some years ago talked about, I forget, it was pornography or I forget, but something in that category. And he said, the thing is, I know it when I see it, but I can't tell you what it looks like in advance. And I would say that about many of the cultural interventions and cultural efforts that I've seen over the years, where, for example, in Korean companies, South Korean companies, which I worked in quite a lot over about a 7-year period, were trying to change their culture in some very important ways. And they would typically do things like I think a lot of companies in the US and Europe also do, where they would have some cultural value and they would recognize a team or an individual who practiced it quite, effectively or kind of in a way that made a difference. And then they would highlight and showcase those people and they would recognize them and they might even have video testimonials about it and so forth. But it wasn't something they could say in advance. This is what it would look like in your job, in your department, in your function. So there's this problem of not being able to really know in advance in a certain way. And one of the things that I think makes that true is that if you think about any given value, whether it's focus on the customer or quality first or diversity and inclusion or you name it, it's going to look different depending on what role, department, or process you're in. Focus on the customer is going to look different in sales and customer service than in research and development or finance. It will have some common theme, but what the actual practice of that value is will look different. Similarly, diversity will look very different in HR than it looks in IT, than it looks in other places in terms of how people actually practice it. So there's this inherent thing, which is that a value statement will get played out or practiced differently. And so bottom line is, if we are trying to set expectations for the people in our organization, we have a set of values that we really want to promulgate and have people practice, how can we set expectations for the individuals in the teams that are going to vary depending on the function that they're serving? So to me, that is an important challenge, and it's something that we need to kind of sort through. And so let's see how we think about this. What I want to talk a little bit, as I said first, though, is about elements of performance thinking. And yes, Amanda, it will be recorded. You will get a link in about 36 hours after this, and eventually it will show up on our YouTube channel, which is at performancethinking.tv. So I want to talk at an overview level of some of the key elements of performance thinking as they relate to it. Now, many of the people that are present in this group here know about Tom Gilbert's work and what a profound influence he had, not only on our work, but on the whole field. Some have said, although arguably there are other points of view about this, that if he was not the father of human performance technology or human performance improvement, he was certainly one of them, along with Gary Rumler and a few others. But one of the major contributions that he made that really was a sea change was to focus on what he called accomplishments. And so in his book, Human Competence, 1978, which we still celebrate and is still taught in graduate programs, he said, in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. Now, by cult of behavior, he didn't mean behaviorists or trainers only. He meant leaders, managers, all of us that have to do with trying to help people perform better. But he said, we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. Now, that's pretty obvious, once said, because the value delivered by people isn't in their activity, it's in the products of the activity. But we don't often see it that way. And this was the point that Tom made a big deal of. And we, over the years, coined the phrase work outputs, because even though accomplishments is a great word, it's kind of a good marketing word and it sounds valuable and all that. If you look at it, if you look it up in the dictionary, there's actually more meanings that have to do with the completion of behavior than the products of behavior. That's the first thing. And the second thing is what I've seen, and I looked some years ago, I looked pretty deeply into the field of performance improvement and organizational behavior management and so forth, where people use this word accomplishment, and it's all over the map. Sometimes it's big organizational level business results. Sometimes it's the completion of behavior. Sometimes it's a lot of different stuff. So because we bring, even though we're very plain English in the Performance Thinking Network, we bring a kind of precision to the table where we want to use our words precisely and know what we're talking about. We coined the phrase work outputs because we think, first of all, it sounds like the product of behavior. But secondly, notice it's plural. And what we think is that work outputs or accomplishments, have to be countable nouns that deliver value. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But anyway, this is a big contribution that Gilbert made that affected us. And so our model, as many of you know, one of our two models is the performance chain. And what we say is that the elements of any human performance are behavior, which is activity, that produces work outputs or accomplishments that are valuable to the extent that they contribute to organizational or possibly societal or business results. And of course, there are behavior influences over far on the far left there that affect the behavior, that hopefully either ideally support the behaviors, sometimes get in the way of it, to produce work outputs that contribute to organizational results. And as the arrows at the top suggest, it works from left to right, but we analyze it from right to left. So that's kind of our basic tool for pulling apart any hunk of performance. And most of you are already kind of aware of that. The focus here right now, though, is on this notion of work outputs, the valuable products of behavior, as you'll see when we get into the culture discussion. And what is in orange there, criteria for good. So we're going to come back to that in a minute. But the basic idea is that if I have some sort of deliverable, a widget or a report, or maybe I have a relationship, or maybe I have a decision or some other kind of work output, what makes it good? What are the characteristics that say, hey, that's up to spec, that's what we need? And so we'll come back to that because we think that turns out to be a key to cultural issues. Now, again, many of you already know this, but if you think about, all right, that's fine. We're looking for work outputs. Where do we find them? What we say is that there's kind of three levels, and performance improvement people in general, they talk about language like, the world, the workplace, and the worker, or the work. Here, this is an organizational relationship map that you don't have to look at in detail. It happens to be a large behavioral health organization from a few years ago. And everything inside of the gray box is the departments and functions inside the organization. And the things outside the big gray box are customers, suppliers, regulators, and so forth. But the point is that these departments, functions, the groups pass things around. And there are processes in there that deliver valuable things, whether those are documents, reports, data sets, whatever they are. And so you can start from the top down. And there's an argument that if you're trying to change culture, as you'll see when we talk a little bit later, you might want to take this view because you might want to say where are the big opportunities for driving a particular value down through the organization. I don't do that much work at this level because most of the companies we work with are global companies and we don't get to work with usually the whole company and the CEO. But I know some of my colleagues do get to do that. Anyway, that's one level. You can find outputs in there. But more commonly, we're looking at processes. And this is a very simple process map, a so-called swim lane diagram, where we have an author, an editor, and an approver who are ultimately producing a content specification document. And like in many process maps, the boxes have descriptions, brief descriptions of activity or steps in them. But what we're looking for are the things that those activities or steps produce. So we can find work outputs in a process, and we make a strong discipline of not only looking at the final product of processes, but insisting that we understand what the countable product of each step in a process is. And some of our much more sophisticated process colleagues, Six Sigma folks and Lean folks, acknowledge when they see this, they say, you're right, we don't always identify the outputs inside of processes. But if you do that, it allows you to measure better, it allows you to diagnose where things went wrong, and so forth. So that's the second place in processes. We look for outputs. And as I mentioned earlier, if you think about values, there are a lot of processes in organizations, and the practice of a given value may look quite different in one process versus another one, but we'll come back to that. And then finally, individuals. And we have a tool we call the individual performance map. And this happens to be of a sales director and the sales director's customers, who are senior account manager, customer service team, and the VP of sales. And those are the sales director's work outputs. That's a description, really, in simple terms, of the sales director's jobs. And we have lots of other examples of those. Many of you know this. We use these in coaching. We use these when we're doing analysis for training or onboarding or hiring. But for example, here's an HR director and all the customers to whom he is an individual actually in a medical devices company delivers value. And he's got everything from process designs to, budget, to recommendations, to budgets, to decisions about things and assignments. There's a whole lot of valuable products of this HR director's day-to-day activity that he produces. And here's a learning coach, very different world. This is in a learning center for kids. And so you have a learning coach delivering things to the family, to the assistant director of the learning center, to the team members, to the consultant, and so forth. Here's an applied behavior analysis, behavioral health company, a senior staffer. It's kind of a mid to senior manager level person. And so you can look here, there's things like lists of goals, and there's sets of materials and curriculum, and progress reports. And there's all kinds of stuff in here, goals and so on, decisions of all kinds. And finally, here's the CEO of actually a private school. And you can see some of his outputs. So we can define jobs in terms of their outputs. We can also define processes in terms of their outputs. So this matter of what's a good one is a big deal, because again, you might have a deliverable of some kind, but how do we know if it's any good? You know, we've all certainly received documents or widgets or seen decisions that were not so good. And so we talk about criteria for a good one is the phrase that we use. And another way people talk about it is, what does good look like? For this deliverable or this transaction or this decision or whatever it is, what does it mean for this one to be good? What are the characteristics of the thing that make it good? And the purpose of that really is a couple things. One is we want to actually understand. We want to have a criterion that we can give people feedback around, we can measure, we can correct and improve and develop, we can reward and all that. We want to also, ultimately, it's about setting clear expectations for the performer, whether I'm a manager working with an individual or a team, or whether we're at a fairly senior level and we're defining outputs that are sort of, big hunks. One way or the other is we want to set expectations for this is what we want you to be able to produce. This is what a good one is. And of course, that also will allow us to then count or tally or evaluate or monitor good ones. So that's why we set criteria as a general part of our performance improvement approach. And here's a few examples, like for the first output, notes from a hiring interview. So that's presumably in a form, and it says all the fields in that form are complete and accurate. The descriptions of interest are easy to understand. Other people can read it, and it's moderately self-explanatory. And all the information is complete by the end of the day. Now, there may be some other criteria, but those are an example. If it's a good template or form, that might be sufficient. Or a program update decision. What if you're updating a training program? Well, that decision ought to address the specific findings from error analysis. And in this context, it's decided that the criteria for a good one is everybody agrees that we're going to make this change or this update. And it also meets current best practices guidelines, which are presumably defined someplace that we can point to. Or relationships. Relationships are very important, extremely valuable work outputs. I always get a kick out of saying that because some people think that sounds very weird. But we did a webinar on this probably a year and a half ago, and it's still the most viewed webinar on our YouTube channel, I think, which is relationships as valuable accomplishments. So, in this case, criteria for a good relationship between, let's say, with a manager and somebody that the manager is supervising, that a lot of times has to do with the behavior between them. So they both respond to messages by the end of the day. The supervisee asks for clarification when needed. In other words, there's enough confidence there and so forth that the supervisee really proactively says, yeah, what did you want me to do again here? There's humor and friendly banter is one of the characteristics that were defined in this case. And also both fairly consistently meet the expectations set by each other. That defines a good working relationship with a supervisee, at least in the case that this instance is from. And then finally, a satisfied client might be someone who says without prompting that they're really happy with what you delivered. They may, classic recommends our services to others, as in the Net Promoter Score, where you're actually asking people to what extent would you recommend what we do to other people. And then, at a personal level, the satisfied client smiles and expresses positive regard in meetings with you. So those are just examples of trying to define with criteria what a good instance of each of those outputs would be. Now, once you've defined that, what influences the practice of cultural values? Because we're going to come back to cultural values in a couple minutes here. But, what I would argue is the same thing that influences the practice of anything The six boxes model, which is our other model, which descended from Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model and has the advantage of being plain English so people can understand it. There's really not anything, both as a trained behavior scientist at Harvard with B.F. Skinner and as a practitioner for almost 50 years now, that I've seen that affects people's behavior that doesn't sort into this framework. So what we would say is that all the variables or all the factors, the behavior influences we call them, in the six boxes model are what would influence practice of cultural values, among other things. And so we sort of put these two models together and we say, and in the case of any performance, we have behavior influences which hopefully are configured to affect in a positive way the desired behavior to produce the work outputs that contribute to business results. So that's kind of the elements that I want to refer back to as we talk about cultural stuff. And one of the things that's perhaps most obvious but is worth stating is when you begin to understand that leaders and managers are responsible for arranging the conditions for the people that they lead or manage, and for them to not only be productive but also to be engaged and happy, you start to recognize that you can frame best practices of leaders or managers in the six boxes model, which is a very nice thing because you realize, for example, leaders articulate a vision, even if it's a team leader. This is what we want to get to. This is how we're trying to get. They also link the vision to strategy and daily activity and so forth. They set goals, they define expectations, they outline expectations and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of things, as an example, in box one, expectations and feedback, that leaders and managers do. And, expectations are a particularly big deal. And this is going to get us to the cultural thing, because if you think about it, if I'm in the IT department and I want to know what focus on the customer looks like, what does that mean for my day-to-day work? I'm not so sure. I don't even meet customers very often. Is this even relevant to my performance in some way? How would this apply? So if I'm a leader or manager, I'd like to set expectations for that person in the IT department about how they might practice a value. And so box one, expectations, is very important. So let's talk about culture then. So that's kind of a framework for thinking about performance in general. If we talk about culture, my own history with this goes back to 1982. And there was a book called Corporate Cultures by Deal and Kennedy. One guy was a Harvard person, the other person was a consultant. And it was a great book, sort of taking the anthropological approach to corporate culture. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then some years later, about a dozen years later, I encountered two of my really late performance improvement gurus, Don Toasty and Stephanie Jackson, who worked on what they called organizational alignment. And I participated in a culture workshop that they did. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that too. They began to talk about values and practices in organizations. And then some years ago, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I was still always puzzling with how do you take Toasty and Jackson's work, for example, into a big company. And I had the good fortune of working in the LG companies and GS Caltex, some very large South Korean companies, and actually working and meeting frequently with Vice Chairman Gong, who is the vice chair of the whole LG group, and also with Jay Lee, who is a senior vice president of human resources at GS Caltex, which is a Korean affiliate of Chevron, and also with the chairman. And so I got to talk to these people about their concerns about cultural issues. And they were at a point, and this is in the early 2000s, where Korean companies had been very successful over the years being command and control. So it was very top down. It was very much the top leaders, I would say, do this, and everybody would say, yes, sir, we'll do it. And there was very little feedback, pushback, questioning, generating options, etc. Well, I was working a little bit with LG and with LG Electronics when they basically missed the boat on the smartphone. And the reason they did this is, to a large extent, they didn't know how to innovate. And if you think about it, a command and control culture does not support innovation very well. You just say yes and do it. You don't push back or suggest other ideas. So they were deep in the struggles, really, of trying to move their cultural, the practice to something where people would question authority, where they'd bring up new ideas, where that sort of thing. And I actually worked a bit with Jay Lee at GS Caltex on that. And I had and when what I'm about to talk about occurred to me, I was literally I can visualize it now. I was sitting in a room where we were delivering our management program to a set of pretty senior managers at GS Caltex. And that's when I had this big insight that I'm going to tell you about. But let me go back and talk a little bit more about these other things and what the issues were. So Kennedy and Deal, what they basically said, they had a very anthropological approach. This is 1982 when they published the book. So my guess is this is based on work they did in the 70s. And so they said, when you go into a new organization, you ought to understand something about the history, where they came from, how they evolved. You need to understand their values and their beliefs. And then it sounds very much like Margaret Mead. You want to understand their rituals and ceremonies, their legends and stories, like the legends of, Steve Jobs at Apple or whatever, their heroes. And then you have to understand their cultural network. Who are the storytellers? Who are the gossips? Who are the whisperers? Who are the priests? In other words, again, it's an anthropological model. And I thought it was fascinating. I was really interested in it, but there are some challenges, because on the one hand, if you're a new person in that company, or let's say hired into a senior executive role in that company, or if you're a consultant, you definitely want to know how things work around here. You want to know the rituals and all the stuff that people do and don't do. But the question is, beyond that awareness and beyond a certain sort of personal adaptation to it, like, what can you do with it? And what we kind of concluded, at least what I concluded, was it wasn't very actionable. It was something that was kind of interesting, but it was really hard to bring it down to ground. So I kind of thought about that for quite a long time. And then in the early 90s, I encountered the work of Don Tosti and Stephanie Jackson, who were talking about aligning operations and culture. And they used various versions of this graphic to point out that in organizations, on the one hand, you have a mission for whatever the organization is, and then you have the goals. And then on the strategy side, you have objectives, and you try to drive the accomplishment of those objectives with behavior to produce results. But that on the culture side, it wasn't about goals, it was about values and practices, which are essentially forms of behavior, which they phrased as how we do things around here. And what they said, as many experts have talked about the fact that culture trumps strategy every time, that the culture part is really important. It makes a big difference. And so that got me sort of interested in this notion of values and practices. And as I say, they phrased that as how we do things around here. You go into a company and you sort of learn how they operate at a kind of, again, a cultural level. There's a story that Don used to talk about a lot. It was kind of an iconic culture story. And what it was that at one point, British Airways was sort of struggling, again, with kind of innovation. And it was in the period where some of the upstart new airlines were showing up. I think actually around the time, for example, when Southwest was appearing. And they were being very innovative. They were doing different stuff. They were coming up with sort of different approaches. And British Airways, almost as a cliche, because the cliche is that Brits keep things close to the chest and all that. What they recognized as they started working with this company is there was a lack of openness. People didn't share information much, only the stuff they really had to. And so what they recognized is that there's a practice. If we wanted to establish the value of openness and how do you practice it, they established a very specific practice, which is that they came up with this kind of statement that they would encourage people when they met with others to say, in the spirit of openness, I'd appreciate your hearing me out and giving me your full considered opinion. And they went through a series of meetings from sort of senior executives on down where people kind of agreed this was important and they kind of got alignment around it. They even had a little card that was gilt-edged around the edge. And it was the openness card and it had that phrase on it. And people kind of agreed that they would do this. And it worked. They began to do it. People kind of lost the cards, but they got in the habit of doing it. And what they began to find is that people were sharing more information. And when they did a culture scan a few years later, or 6 months later, actually, I think, it made a difference. And they began to notice some impact on how innovative they could be. But there were limitations to this as I looked at it. I tried to get to work with Don for quite a while. He was I learned a lot from him, and I was trying to learn about this work, but I couldn't. He didn't encounter another client organization where he could bring me in on it, and so I was always observing from a distance. But the challenge with this kind of approach is it really needs to be top down. It needs to be aligned up and down the whole organization, and there needs to be agreement about how we're going to do it. And what I perceived was that this notion of the practice of openness in one-to-one conversations could probably apply to almost anybody at any level in any function in the company. And so in a certain sense, it was a lucky find, because things like diversity or things like focus on the customer don't necessarily look the same in every context across the organization. They have to get practiced differently. They become sort of a philosophy that you have to turn into something actionable. And so I found this challenging because it actually sort of supported my observation that there's a lot of executives and a lot of Harvard Business Review articles and so forth who talk about culture and maybe do cultural assessments. But the question is, how do you move the lever? How do you get specific enough so the people in the different departments and processes and such will get it? So we think we can do better. And let me try to unpack this with respect to performance thinking. What we're suggesting is, back to the performance chain, is if and this was the big aha that I had in the meeting in the South Korean company when I was just sitting there with these managers thinking about it. The first thing is that if you think about a value, a statement of value, focus on the customer, quality first, diversity, whatever it is, first of all, it's going to affect many outputs. So, for example, and of course, the behavior for producing them. So it's both. So that's where cultural values and practice hit home. They affect the criteria, what makes for a good work output, and then probably the behavior for producing it, because criteria usually do have an impact on that. And so what I started to realize, the big insight was, first of all, if you think about the 6 boxes, if we can look at the performance of a role or a process and define the work outputs, we ought to be able to say, oh, this value applies to these work outputs. It may not apply to some of the other ones, but it applies to these ones in this process and in this job. And then that would, in order to produce the outputs to meet the criteria, you'd have to behave a little bit differently. And of course, if you can figure that out, then you can set expectations for the individuals that work for you or in your department or that you lead, and you can begin to arrange the rest of the behavior influences to support that behavior. So that was the big insight. That was like a flash of insight as I was sitting there. And this is some typical value statements you would see in an organization. These are just pulled out of the various places. There's lots of other ones. I suspect that many of you come from companies where there are value statements. A lot of times they're just on the wall and they're in the orientation, and then it's like, where did those values go? But anyway, these are typical kinds of statements about something we'd like to practice in our organization. And then, of course, there are many types of work outputs. We use this list, as those of you who've gone through any of our programs know. This list is not a taxonomy, but it's a set of words. The green words and phrases are words that we use when we're analyzing performance, because there's lots of different work outputs or accomplishments that sort of don't get noticed if you don't look for them. So things like decisions, which are obviously very valuable outputs, sometimes people don't think of them when they're talking about accomplishments or outputs, because they think of it as behavior, or they don't think they're tangible enough or whatever. Or things like transactions, where there's an exchange of something, a sale or a loan, that's an output. Or relationships, which are extremely valuable outputs that we work to establish and maintain. Or solutions, or people or teams that, those are all kinds of work outputs. And so if you start thinking about those and look at them with sort of a value in mind, the question is, how does that affect, what's the influence of that value on what would be a good one? So I want to give you a few examples of how we think through this, and then I think we'll have a few minutes for Q&A stuff. So here's one. This is the Toasty and Jackson example. So we've got a given output, which is a decision made in a one-to-one meeting. Now, the typical default value usually is career advancement. I mean, usually if people are in meeting with one other person, they're trying to get to some decision. As often as not, it's really about what I'm trying to get out of the deal. And so the criteria for a good one is, um, if it goes my way, and probably I'm most likely, in the absence of anything else, going to disclose mostly what's necessary to move things toward where I want it to go. On the other hand, if you're in an organization where openness is explicitly stated and you're having a meeting with somebody one-to-one, then first of all, the criteria itself is that this decision is based on full mutual disclosure. All facts are in on the table. And then, of course, the phrase that they had on their openness card, in the spirit of openness, I'd appreciate your hearing me out and giving me your full considered opinion, which is an actual statement of the practice that they were asking people to do. So that's just the example of the toasty one in terms of the criteria and behavior that value might suggest for a specific thing, which is a decision that comes out of that meeting. And you can go further and you can do this. This is a slice of what we call our multi-table when we analyze performance. And you can see the values, openness, the work outputs is decision, the criteria, the behavior. And then the numbers are the cells in the 6 boxes. These are the behavior influences that can be put in place to make that practice of that value more likely. So again, by defining criteria and looking at changes in behavior that will be required for a given output, we can then begin to set expectations, and then we can, it froze. So are we frozen for other people? So Pablo says it's frozen. Is it frozen for others? May I ask? Can you guys hear me? Okay, some people are. Okay, so it might depend on, Pablo, it might depend more on your internet than mine. But anyway, this will get recorded, so we'll hoping it's working. So here's another one. Here's a very popular value, diversity. So good, thank you everybody, appreciate it. So diversity, and the output it's in the hiring process, but the output is a hiring decision. So a typical thing, if you think about the hiring process in most organizations, especially these days when people are scrambling to try to just fill their spots, the typical implicit value would be like fill the job as quickly as we can with a good person. And so the criteria for the hiring decision would be based on candidates from the sources we've always gotten them from. And it's, by chance, maybe there's diverse members on the hiring team, but that's not the focus. And so we're making the screening and interviews and so forth efficient. We're trying to maximize candidate headcount. We're trying to include the usual hiring team members, et cetera. I mean, that's the typical thing. But what if you say we're trying to drive diversity down through our hiring process? Well, you might say that, first of all, the hiring decision itself needs to be based on a wider than usual selection of people. We gotta find more candidates of color, of different genders, of ethnicity, and so forth. We got to have a bigger pool, because we're not going to be able to make a hiring decision that reflects diversity if we don't. And then the flip side of that is the team that's involved in the hiring process ought to be diverse themselves, as they say, they ought to look like who they're trying to get. So that changes the criteria for what makes for a good decision, and then you can see the behavior plays out. You say, wait a minute, we got to find some other candidates here that flesh out a more diverse set of sources. And we've got to explicitly mention the value of diversity in the job description. And we got to check to be sure that our hiring team actually reflects the kind of diversity we care about in this organization. So you're starting to get pretty explicit here in terms of expectations. Here's another one. This is actually one of my favorites from an old client of ours. Fairness to customers in the pricing agreement. This is from a big company that does logistics. And this was years ago, well before the supply chain issues that we have now. But this is a company that helps clients move large amounts of stuff in their supply chain around, with boats and trains and and trucks and airplanes. And they have a thing called the pricing agreement, or at least they did then. And it was a kind of a complicated spreadsheet. And it had all these numbers in it related to distance and how far they have to go and what kind of stuff and what the form of transportation is. And they also had a very strong commitment to the value of fairness to customers, because what they felt in the long term was if customers perceived them as fair, that they would come back for more business. So in a typical environment, which these guys, by the way, described as cigar chomping backroom guys, because they viewed a lot of their competitors as not all that professional. Um, so basically, the default value is typically the bottom line. What they would say is a good pricing agreement is to make it as profitable as you can for the company without losing the business. And so your behavior would be optimize all the spreadsheets so we make as much money as we can, but we try to do it in a way that doesn't create sticker shock. But what these guys did, and they really did this, is they said, no, we want to practice fairness to customers. So of our pricing agreement, we're trying to make it as low as possible for the customer, but maintain a certain profit margin. So in other words, they had a minimum profit margin. They didn't want to sell it for a loss, but their view was as long as they could get whatever that margin was, they wanted to optimize it so it was the best deal they could offer. And, they get repeat business. So I thought that was a really cool example because it was very counter to most people's business sense of, wait a minute, we want to be as profitable as we can be. Here's one. This is kind of a straw man a little bit, but for me, it reflects at least the experience I used to have in the 90s and early 2000s. Maybe things are better, and you can probably figure out who I'm talking about. But if you're deciding what your final decision about your feature list and your design of a piece of software for any given, revision version of that software, if your value is about the most advanced technology, if you're really trying to be the technology people, then your decision about the final product design is, as the former chairman and founder of one company used to say, we've got a lot of neat technology here. And so you have as many features as you can possibly put in there, and neat features, and you want to have a tolerable way to navigate it. You want to be able to move around, even though it might not be the best, but at least it works. Well, there was another company during that same period where the founder and chairman believed in simplicity and a focus on user experience. And so the decision there about final product design was related to, they wanted the interface to be as elegant and as beautiful as it could be while delivering maximum value. And in fact, that late chairman, that leader of that company, used to say his most important job was to say no to all the add-ins and features. So this is an example of where a cultural value of simplicity or user experience gets driven down specifically to decisions about the product. Here's I think the last one. There might be another one here too, but inclusion. Now here we mean inclusion more than on a whole bunch of dimensions. For example, with respect to various kinds of handicaps. And I was actually one of our larger clients recently. We were working on this kind of a thing with them, and so sort of coincidental. But in typical work environments, and the output here is a design for a group work area where a bunch of people are working. A space that people are working. And so, typically people will be talking about productivity. That would be the thing we care about. It's sort of a business result. And so they would lay out the space, the work area, so you could reach the printers and scanners and so forth easily and quickly. And the extra tools and supplies would be, convenient shelves above the workspace. And the tables would all be fixed height, so everything could be moved around easily, and everything be kind of interchangeable. And it would hopefully be, below budget. It would, you would be able to afford this. And so they would use quantitative analysis to figure out the distances and shape and how many square feet per person and all that kind of stuff. That would be how they go about it. However, if your company was committed to inclusion of people, maybe in wheelchairs, maybe with some sensory deficits, maybe with some other kinds of issues that made them a bigger variation, a bigger range of types of folks, at that point, you'd be doing things like looking at the layout of your furniture based on the widest possible range of personal and use cases. You'd be saying, well, what about people who are left-handed? What about people who, are in wheelchairs? What about people who have to be on walkers, et cetera, whatever it is, who have auditory problems? So you'd be starting to look at the layout of stuff physically based on this broad use cases. You'd want the furniture, if possible, to be adjustable. You'd want supplies to be within easy reach, even for those people who couldn't stand up. And you want to build it to accommodate. And so that would lead to a whole bunch of different activity for producing that design. It would have a different set of criteria, and you would have to do different stuff, including probably user testing it with the kinds of folks that you were interested in including. So those are some examples, and that was my last example, I was right. But the general thing we're taking out of this is this notion that if we want to strengthen the practice of cultural values, and we want to do it more than some sort of abstraction and goodness level of philosophy, if we look at a job in a department or in our team or in a process, and we first of all identify the work outputs and the criteria and behavior, and then we say, which of these outputs does this value even apply to? Diversity, or focus on the customer, or quality, or whatever it is, innovation. It doesn't really apply to budgets, but it really applies to product designs. It doesn't really apply to the accountants we choose, but it probably affects how we hire people, et cetera. I mean, you're gonna look at the outputs involved with this filter of the value and say, where would this even have an effect? And then you would look at the outputs and you would tweak those criteria as much as you could to be objective characteristics of the outputs that would then line up with that value. And then you would you'd basically look at what behavior was needed to produce those differently, what tactics and tasks are needed. And then you'd set expectations and arrange behavior influences. Now, this is something which is down at ground level. It can't be done probably even from HR. It probably needs to be done at ground level, which is why we think ultimately, if you're going to drive culture through an organization, you need to teach your leaders and your managers and your frontline supervisors how to think this way. You maybe don't have to turn them into performance consultants. We have a coaching program which is pretty simple, but it teaches people to work with the individuals that they coach or manage or lead and do their individual performance maps and look at their performance and have discussions to improve it. Well, if we could teach that, if that was part of the development of leaders, managers, and supervisors, and it was linked up with the values that we consider important in this organization, then you could, I am sure, do a much better job of bringing the practice of those values down to the level of the individuals, the teams, the departments, and the processes in your organization, and all the diverse ways in which those values apply. So that's our story. That's what we think. And I also presented this actually recently in the ISPI conference. And one of the people I respect a lot, Bonnie Beresford, who is a measurement expert, performance measurement expert, has been around for a long time. She said at the end of the session, she said, this is the first thing I've seen that I think is actionable with respect to this kind of topic. So that's the deal. So any comments, questions? Are you still with me? What do you think? Anybody? I'm just looking at the chat box right now. Anyone? Is anyone still with me here? Looking at attendees, still got some people. Questions, maybe? Questions, comments, observations? Well, I appreciate your positive feedback, but what do you think? Could you apply this? Amanda, yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I think, oh, that's beautiful then. You're a perfect person to listen to this. I think that there's a lot of opportunity here. And, this is one of the reasons that Johnny Taylor's book struck me, because this is a man who's been a business executive, not just a staff type leader. And so he gets it about organizations, and he gets it about the need for change of culture, and he's highly critical of the way it typically is done. So reading that prompted me a lot about, thinking about this. What do you think? Maybe I should ask a question, see if anybody responds in the chat box. Do you think it's a legitimate sort of comment that the practice of a value varies a lot depending on your role or process? Does that make sense to you? It seems obvious to me, but I may be missing something. So Pablo, it's your day-to-day challenge. Well, there you go. So I'm sorry, by the way, I missed you on our connection the other day, but hopefully we can reconnect soon. So you think so, Jasmine? It's good to hear. Yeah, so that to me is the deal. And I think when I hear about culture, I get all excited. But I think until you figure out how you get it down to the people, it's probably not going to work. Yeah, it's not usually conceptualized this way, I don't think. And that was why I literally was sitting in this meeting a few years ago, and I was like, oh my God, this would work. Um, so I think suggested for building cultures of inclusion, Cindy. I think I'm not an expert in that regard at all. I think actually reading Johnny's book might be helpful because he's got some good stuff about that. But one of the things that I think is it's both top down and bottoms up. In other words, you have to have leadership which says we want a culture of inclusion here. But then I think instead of having sort of high level policies only, I think you really do need to do something with your managers and leaders at the level of teams and departments where they say, let's take a look at the major processes, let's say, in our department. And let's look at the steps and outputs in these things, whatever they are, whether it's needs analysis for trainers or some manufacturing process, whatever it is, it's customer service. And then we say, wait a minute, let's look at how this value, which of these things does it affect? And then have some agreement about that, and then move forward to try to make whatever those outputs and the behavior to produce them reflect inclusion, whatever it's decided that is. Teams and departments. Yeah, and the thing about it is that I don't think this can be done I don't think the head of HR is going to figure it out for the customer service reps. They may at some level be able to. They may, for example, be able to look at an organizational relationship map and say, for inclusion, clearly in HR and the hiring decisions we have and some of the how we do performance management, we got to take things into account like code switching and some of the different ethnic and cultural backgrounds people have and be sure to accommodate that. Maybe in contracting, maybe we've got language we have to take into account. Maybe we have other places where we can look specifically, but I really think it's going to come down to the level. They always say, like the employee engagement people always say, that you work for your manager. And I think in this case, it's especially true. Of course, we need to hire managers who are in line with that value. That's kind of the bottom line. Yeah, I think this could apply for crisis leadership. The thing is, our core approach to leadership and management is reflected in our coaching program. If you go to our website, you'll see about the coaching program, and it starts just by teaching individuals, managers, supervisors, coaches to sit down with individuals, define their outputs in the individual performance map, which is a skill that you can develop fairly readily, and then to over time use that as a foundation for continuously developing people. Like, let's improve your work outputs, let's add some stuff for the next step in your career path and so forth. But once you learn those two models and how they apply, you can move into, let's say, a departmental role, and you can start to look at how you make processes happen in your department or whatever. You can sort of move up the scale, applying the models, the performance chain and 6 boxes model, to apply it not just for individuals, but for whole teams. I'm looking at Don's comment. It was output oriented, not culture. Yes. Well, the thing is, I think, Don, that's a very interesting comment. I think they have to come together. In other words, of course we need a culture that contributes to organizational results and so forth. But we also, just as a society, I mean, if there's one thing the last few years have shown us, between COVID and Black Lives Matter and all these people getting murdered and so forth, and how much bias there is inside of organizations, the obvious values of inclusion, diversity, and so forth have to be taken into account. But there's a lot more subtle ones too. For example, my sort of colleague Howard Bihar, who was a big proponent of servant leadership. Like, what does I think the value he talks about, people first, put people first. That could be a value in an organization. What does that look like in your day-to-day activity with people? Fantastic. I'd like to learn more about behavior leader. Anyway, thank you, everybody. I think we're probably done. I really appreciate your lots of feedback here in the and comments. And has been recorded, and you should get a link in an email in about 36 hours. And if you don't, around that time, it will probably also get posted in our YouTube channel, which is performancethinking.tv. So thanks for showing up. And again, we won't be doing a webinar this next month, but we'll do one in July. And I hope to have you guys back for that. So thank you.